nonprofit community, making Kansas City a better place to live, work, and play. This Casey Cares segment is brought to you by the Ewing, Marion Kauffman Foundation, www.kauffman.org. I'm Ruth Baum-Biggis. The making up a judgment about the amount, number, or value of something. Evaluation. It is important for nonprofits to evaluate what they do and how they do it, especially for its funders and supporters. Having third-party evaluations are ideal, but many in the sector are challenged with the capacity to make that happen. However, that doesn't have to stop you from evaluating where you are and planning for where you want your organization to be in the future. Joining us for this episode of Ask the Expert is a leader in the area of evaluation, Dr. Jessica Mindnich. She is Senior Director of Evaluation, Learning, and Impact Stories at the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation. Dr. Jessica, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here today.
All right. I had to do the little definition of evaluation. I don't know if that helps people or scares them off. How would you define what evaluation is and why is it important for nonprofits?
Yeah, I really think about evaluation more as learning, right? Learning is the big umbrella. Evaluation is a tool under that umbrella. But I think all organizations want to be learning organizations, nonprofit, for-profit, right? Especially as our world becomes increasingly complex. Learning is necessary, right? Things aren't easily known. And so we have to be willing and able to pivot. And I think really building in learning and cycles of learning, pulling together information, both numbers and narrative, help you to really make informed decisions so that we can have the impact we want to have in the world. Anyone in the nonprofit sector, and I've been in the nonprofit sector for my entire career, is here because they have a passion, right? They are trying to do good in the world. So I hope that this can just be more tools in that tool chest to help us do our work better.
So with that definition, how do we incorporate that? And who should incorporate it? Is it for every nonprofit?
I would argue that it is for every nonprofit. And the way I try to think about it is, what are the things you're already doing where it's really just adding in a little bit more, a few extra steps? For example, annual planning. Every organization does annual planning, but do you do it with those questions of, okay, over this next year, what is the impact we're really trying to have? What are the things we're going to need to know? What do we know now about the current state, right? It doesn't have to be this big, arduous thing. In fact, I think if you build it in as a practice, where it's small, but it's consistent, I actually think you'll be more effective in using it. A lot of times when people build these big, robust systems, the problem is it takes you so long to get that information and data back that by the time you're using it, there's this lag, right, between the time it was collected and the time you're actually sitting there with it, pondering what to do next.
I'm glad you mentioned that lag. That seems to be a challenge. Mm-hmm. How, as you enter into doing evaluation, can you make sure there isn't a lag, that you're not dealing with, for example, 2021 data when you're 3/4 through 2022?
Yeah. Well, I think sometimes, you're going to have a lag and that's okay. But I think it's to understand, where are those places that you need kind of rapid real-time data. I'm a huge fan of automation. So what's the data that we're collecting that we can build into a dashboard? Because we know we have these questions all the time and we automate it, right? So the data is there at any time. We can go, we can look at it, and it helps inform our decisions. So that's what I would say, is really try to find what are those places where you're already collecting data that you can create something that's automated. It is an investment of time and potentially money, but it's one of those things that it's an upfront investment and then it continues to pay off over time.
Well, I really jumped over a big hurdle, and that's how can you get people to not be afraid of Evaluating.
Yeah. Honestly, evaluators are a big reason people are afraid of evaluation. So I think about, for me, there's a value alignment in the evaluators that we select. So at Kauffman, we practice equitable evaluation, right? So we're really trying to hold a lens of what is it that we need to know to understand how to advance equitable outcomes for people. And so that means understanding the history, understanding and valuing people's experiences and voices. As an example, we actually just had an evaluation. We had a racial equity community of practice that Kauffman sponsored. And I brought in evaluators that I knew had this learning orientation, had a commitment to equity. And the facilitators were afraid, right? They were like, oh God, we've had to do this before. We don't want to do this. And they just gave such glowing reviews of the evaluator, right? As really being a thought partner. We had built in rapid cycles so that they were getting information in real time so that they could pivot what they were doing. The technical term for that is developmental evaluation. So I really think it's about an evaluation shouldn't be set up as a gotcha, right? I think a lot of times that has been people's experience. It really should be set up as like, this is a vehicle to help you formalize learning, right? Because sometimes it's just hard to wear all of those hats. Anyone in the nonprofit sector, I'm sure, is wearing multiple hats, but can you add another one, right? It's kind of like what we ask teachers to do: be a teacher, be a counselor, be a nurse,
Right.
And so sometimes it's just helpful to have somebody that's the only hat they're wearing. Yeah, but I think that, I would argue that it's about finding the right evaluator for what it is you're trying to accomplish.
Okay, so you open that opportunity. How do you find the right evaluator? Is there a set of criteria? Help us out. We need those tips.
Yeah, absolutely. So there is an organization called Expanding the Bench. They have a database of evaluators that are all certified in culturally relevant and equitable evaluation. So that for us is a kind of go-to. And we just, again, we're practicing all new things ourselves here, but we did a request letter for interest, right? So we held a webinar. We said, here's what we're trying to do, and then asked people to submit very short proposals because you don't want to be onerous. If this sounded of interest to them, we got, I think, 15 responses, and 4 that were really, really good that we're now trying to evaluate which one we think is the right one. We're going to be doing interviews. And we also had a panel, right? So we included not just the foundation, but also people who are involved in this program so that they can also have a say in the evaluator. So those are the types of strategies I would say you can use to make sure that you're finding the right evaluation partner.
Well, I know in our prep materials, we went back and forth and talked about, we want to make this very helpful and usable for the smaller nonprofits who probably don't have capacity in terms of finances to bring in an outside, that third party. So what do they do?
Yeah. So one of the things that I talked about is there's this tool called a before action review and an after action review. And this is, again, how you start to prime. To me, evaluation is more, it's a way of thinking, right? That evaluative thinking, to really get clear on what is it that we're trying to get out of whatever it is. You can use it for a meeting, you can use it for a project. And then afterwards, really comparing what happened. Did what we expect happen? If so, why? If not, why not? There's also tools like a plan, do, study, act, which is about rapid evaluation, right? How do you very quickly try new things and figure out, is it working or do we need to pivot? So I think there's, again, it's more of an orientation, I would say. And There's a lot of little things that you can do to build into your daily practices. I think one of the things that's really important right now, I'm reading The Fearless Organization, right? So I think a lot of times you have to make sure that you have an organizational culture that values and prioritizes learning. So failure isn't a scary thing, right? It's a learning opportunity. And if we encourage people when they fail, you're not reprimanded, but it's like, oh, let's talk about this together. Let's understand what we could do better next time. And that goes to, the other thing that I am a firm believer in is not a perfectionist mindset, but a continuous improvement, right? So we should always there's always something we can do a little bit better. And if we just have that mind, that orientation, then it's not so scary when we find something that we're like, oh, this isn't quite as good as we want it to be. How can we make this better, right? Because we know collectively we're always looking for those opportunities to do and be better.
I hear a continuous thread underneath of communication.
Yes. Yeah.
You've worked with many nonprofits.
Mm-hmm.
Share with us how that has to be wrapped in to having effective evaluation.
Yeah, absolutely. I really think, so I'm going to talk from the funder perspective, because there was also the point where I was the grantee, but from the funder's perspective, to me, it's about really partnering with nonprofits, because ultimately they know the people they're serving, they know what they're trying to accomplish. So it's really understanding, and I can give you a couple examples. So we've been working since I started. We have a small cohort of nonprofits. We're experimenting with building the data capacity of nonprofits, right? How do we build impact measurement? We're using a platform called UpMetrics. So we wanted to make that available for nonprofits. I'm a big believer in, like, if we have the tool and the resources, how do we make sure that's accessible to the grantees that we're working with? So we have a small cohort that we're working with, and we're really learning with them, and we're sharing, like, hey, like, we're having a hard time building this out too. It's taking a lot of time. It's slower than we thought. And I hope that by also sharing with them and being really transparent about what's working and not working for us, it makes it a little less scary. We're also getting ready to launch a learning community with grantees that are working with entrepreneurs in the Heartland. So that'll be launching in October. But I think, again, so if we really, I'm not the expert, right? The nonprofit's the expert. And so I'm just here to help facilitate learning, to ask clarifying questions. I always give this example, and to your point about communication, so many times people believe they've communicated and we're heading down the same path. But I say it like this. So if I said apple, we both go, oh yeah, apple. Okay, we're good. I said, bring me an apple tomorrow. I wanted a Red Delicious and you brought me a Fuji, right? We walked away. We thought we said and meant the same thing. But we all have experiences that create these mental models and the things that we just default to. And so I think that's why it's so important. And I spend a lot of time up front of really clarifying, like, what opportunity, right? That's a word that people use. Community is a word people, and I ask, like, who do you actually mean when you say community? Because sometimes people mean grantees. Sometimes people mean the beneficiaries of grantees. Sometimes people mean people in a neighborhood, ethnic, it can mean so many things. But I think really having a discipline of identifying, like, where's that fuzzy language for us? And have we spent the time to, as an organization, make sure we have shared meaning and understanding of what that means, right? So that we are all rowing in the same direction. To me, that is an example of evaluative thinking. And we all move so fast, and nonprofits, just because of the way funding is set up, I understand there's never quite enough money or time. And so I think then it really becomes about being selective, right? Don't try to do everything, but what are the most important things? Do that. Just try to do that. And then as you build that out, it will help you decide what to prioritize next.
We're talking with Dr. Jessica Mindnich. She's Senior Director of Evaluation, Learning, and Impact Stories at the Kauffman Foundation. All right, you brought in another word. It was a 4-letter word, starts with a T, time. And you mentioned so many times, nonprofits are scurrying just to do mission.
Right.
And in this day and age, now with employment, to keep ranks full.
Yeah.
So how do we, in your wisdom, because you've worked with lots, how do we find that balance? How do we create that time, possibly?
Yeah. Time is the one thing, right? It's a limited resource. I think, again, it's you might have to just start with like, what are 3 questions we want to ask at the beginning of a project? When we're creating a budget, where is one that, are there 5 questions we always want to make sure we ask ourselves, right? So what are the low lift things that you can start to embed and practice? I think the other thing is, I would say, really, if you're getting funding, I understand funders ask for impact metrics. To the extent that you can negotiate and say, here's actually what we're already collecting. What of this might be useful, right? And I will say I am working both within Kauffman and the broader philanthropic sector. This has been like a pet peeve of mine. Like, how do we actually not create this craziness for nonprofits? And I know it's very hard in a funder grantee relationship. And as a grantee, I can tell you there were many times where I spent hours on a final report and then had a conversation with my program officer, and it was very clear they didn't read it. Right? That's very frustrating. So I really empathize with that. For anyone that's a Kauffman grantee, you'll notice we went from asking for 10 outputs and outcomes to like 3 impact metrics, right? Like, what's the most important? And we're striving to how we get better and better aligned so it doesn't feel arduous, but more it's like, my ideal is that nonprofits are sharing with us, here's what we're learning. Here's how we know we're having the impact we want to know. It should be data, in my mind, that the organization is collecting because they know they need that information to know that they're doing the good and the change they want to do in the world, right? And I know it's not always possible, but I would say at least try. Again, I think we're evolving, and I'm hoping that we're going to get to a place where it's just a lot cleaner, clearer, and less arduous for nonprofits. Because the worst thing is, like, there's one piece of work that you're doing, but you've got to now create the data in 10 different ways for 10 different funders. That's crazy making.
Absolutely. I think all of us in the nonprofit feel that pain, and we want to be good stewards of the grant money that's given to us to accomplish mission, but then showcasing mission and what we're accomplishing is sometimes very, very challenging, and keeps some of us up at night.
Yes. Well, I will say, I just want to add the other thing, and we're making this shift as well, is valuing stories as data, right? It may be, some things are hard to quantify, especially if it's new work that you're piloting. But if you can give a really good example, right, of what this work looks like, and it doesn't even have to be one that you're writing up, it can be something that was written up in the media, something that's in a blog post, something that, like, there is data all around us all the time, right? So it's also, I think, shifting a little bit of what we deem data. I learned, because in my mind, I've always been a qualitative mixed methods researcher, meaning I use both narrative and numbers. And I realized in talking to folks that when I say data, they're only thinking about numbers. So I try to be really explicit and saying, no, it's both, right? Numbers give us something. I always think about like they're the framework. If you're doing a coloring book, it's the outline. And then it's the narrative, it's the stories that help us fill in the color, that help us really understand what's happening, the nuance of the change we're driving towards.
I love that analogy. That's great. So would-be granters out there, think of it as a coloring book and not just, dot to dot, which number do I go to? I'm so glad you switched because of your title being impact stories and the narrative, because there is so much out there. So to us nonprofits, is it how to glean those good stories, how to, and how, that there's the challenge too with some organizations, one which I work with, you have a client, confidentiality. Yeah. So are there tips and ways to do that so that if I come to you as a potential grantee and I use a narrative, that you won't go, oh, they made Mary's story up?
Oh, wow. I was like, I guess I do that.
I guess I just went to the dark side. I shouldn't have done that. But,
I
are in a world of crazy.
I think one of the things too that you can do if you have confidentiality, and we fund the quality of life survey. And so we've now added a qualitative component, and we've made up, like, we know the age, we know the gender, we know the race, ethnicity, but we kind of made up, what did we call them? Kind of caricatures of a person, right? And we say this is not the real person, but this is what we know about the person. And so we're just trying to make them vignettes, right? We're trying to make them more real. And so I think you can do something like that. I also think there's also power in themes, right? Like, we serviced 5 women, and these were the common things that we heard among all 5. That's equally powerful. And so, I would say don't be afraid to talk about impact through stories.
Is it okay to maybe put out to those you serve? There are various missions for nonprofits, just to say, we're so happy we could provide XYZ or help you or blah, blah, blah. Can you provide us that, quote, I would call it a testimonial, but, that feedback, is that part of what you're talking? I mean, to me, absolutely. I just pivoted on you, but to me, you're talking about creative evaluative tools. Don't be stuck in your box of just 6 people were impacted by.
Exactly. And, several roles ago, I was working at a nonprofit that did policy advocacy, right? And so it's very hard to demonstrate impact unless something's passed or defeated. And so I would collect those stories, right? Like, hey, I went to this place in San Diego, and as a result of my sharing data, this legislator sponsored this bill, right? Oral health for children became an issue for them. I went to Fresno and talked about this data, and then the executive director for First 5, which focuses on early childhood, then went to these 5 legislators showing why they need to prioritize asthma as an issue for kids. So I very much use that myself when on the nonprofit side, because I think it's important, right? And it's a way to demonstrate impact, particularly when it's like longer term, right? And you have to have these like interim steps that kind of change momentum. So I would definitely encourage nonprofits to think expansively about what could demonstrate impact, and ask for testimonials. Feedback loops are really important, not just to give you like testimonials, but also it shouldn't just be tell us the great experience, but tell us your experience, right? Because you may also learn, there's actually something we could do a little bit better here. And there are definitely organizations that help nonprofits build out those feedback loops and cycles that can both help you improve your services and also give you some of those testimonials, impact stories that would be helpful to you.
Now, is Kauffman somewhere nonprofits could turn for some advice on how to do, evaluation or learn more about evaluative thinking?
I think so. I think one of the things I'm also thinking about, I've been in my role almost 2 years, is what kinds of things could we also fund and make available more broadly, right? Like, do we want to have a learning sector for nonprofits, right? If there are themes that are coming up, I'm always thinking, how do we serve the most amount of people? So yeah, I would say definitely come. You can follow up with me and I will either plug you into a resource and also make notes about what are things that we could do to help provide for the needs of the nonprofit sector overall.
So always check out www.kauffman.org, right?
Yeah, I will say that we have to update our evaluation piece on the website, but yes.
It's just a journey, right?
Yes, exactly.
We just have a couple minutes left. What are the top 3 things we should keep in mind as we look at evaluation?
Keep in mind. So prioritize learning, make it safe, make it fun. 2, don't try to do everything, right? Be very clear. And then I think 3, focus on clarity. Make sure that you are saying and meaning the same thing.
So talk to each other, right? Have a conversation.
So important. We do people work.
You can get off your phone and not text it, but pick up a phone or a Zoom and have a conversation. How did you get into this work?
Oh my gosh. I joke that I never have had a job as a professional that I knew existed as a kid. So I would be honest and say I kind of backed into it, right? I think I didn't know this role existed until I had a program officer that had this role.
Right.
And for me, transitioning, the San Francisco Foundation did a lot of policy work. So it was sort of a natural, easy transition going from a policy advocacy organization. And that's how I ended up. It's not a glorious story. It's not something I knew I wanted to do.
But an important message that just because it isn't out there, young people, doesn't mean it doesn't exist. If it's something that you think is important, you want to do.
Absolutely. All the time, I'm like, oh, that's a job? Right. And they say 40% of jobs that will exist in the future don't exist now. So I tell my girls all the time, your job is not to know exactly what you want to do. Your job is to develop some core skills, and then you're going to have to figure it out.
Get educated, right?
Yes. Yes.
And that's what Kauffman is all about. Thank you so much, Jessica, for being our Ask the Expert.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you for joining us on KC Cares, Kansas City's nonprofit voice. We're produced by a nonprofit, Charitable Communications. This KC Cares segment was brought to you by the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation, www.kauffman.org. To be a guest on KC Cares or underwriting opportunities to support what we do, please visit our website, kccaresonline.org. And spread the love. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter at KC Cares Radio, and on Instagram at KC Cares Online. Don't forget, you can catch us Saturday mornings at 8 a.m. on ESPN 1510 and 94.5 FM. Thank you for joining us on KC Cares.